I was asked to speak about climate change, what's new? And because I would love for this to be a dialogue with all of us, I do want you, if you have your phone there, or you can do this on your computer, to go to pollev.com, that's pollev.com/Texas Tech. And the first question I'm going to ask you is an easy one. All you have to do is point. Where are you joining us from? I see there's already a few early adopters. It looks like we have the Northwest Territories in Canada is very well represented. Actually, that might be Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Interesting. A lot across the US. There's one in BC. We've got a couple up there in Spain, it looks like. Maybe Portugal. Great. Oh, we've got Peru. Excellent. A lot on the East Coast. Oh, excellent. Sweden. All right. That's the beauty of these webinars, isn't it? So often we do events in person and there's great value to seeing each other face to face. But when we do these events online, people can join from all over the world. And right now, all over the world, no matter who we are and where we live, we're living very similar lives. So my next question to you has to be answered with one word. Ready? If you have to use two words, you can cheat, but you need to join your words with a dot, okay? If the quarantine, I should say, lasted until the end of this year, what would you still have enough of? My answer to this is maple syrup. I would have to use a dot though, maple dot syrup. Yes, I agree. I also have enough work to do too. Ew, I like that curiosity. Yes, stress. Beer, you have enough beer. Where do you live? Is it in Texas? Eggs, I'm not sure about that. Eggs can go bad unless you have the chickens. If you have the chickens, then definitely the eggs. I also have enough books to last me the end of the year, and I'm doing some great reading that I haven't done in years. It's fantastic. Family, that could be good or bad, right? Enough family to last you, enough rice, enough hope. That's excellent. I like that one. Enough tortilla chips. That's amazing. Muesli, yes. Soap, I could understand. Tissue, that's an excellent thing to have. You could probably sell some of that on the black market if you wanted to. Unread articles, yeah, I don't even want to talk about that, and I definitely do not want to talk about the email queue either. All right, it looks like we have a consensus on books with a strong emphasis on beer, rice, and tortilla chips of all things. But I love that curiosity is still holding strong. All right. So I've been asked to talk about what's new. But before I talk about what's new, we have to talk about what is very old. So when we talk about climate science, when we talk about the fact that digging up coal and then later oil and natural gas is releasing heat-trapping gases that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, how long have we known this? Have we known this since the 1850s, the 1900s, the 1950s, since 1998, which is when Jim Hansen testified to Congress during a record warm summer, or did we not find out about any of this until the movie The Inconvenient Truth was released? All right, it looks like we have a strong investment in A, but the 1950s is rising quickly. That's the second answer. So the 1950s was, actually the 1960s, was when scientists knew enough about climate change to formally warn a US president of the dangers posed by a changing climate. That was Lyndon B. Johnson, and that was 55 years ago. But the very first scientists studying how long we've known about this extra blanket we're wrapping around the planet were indeed from the 1800s. Yes. Joseph Fourier, the famous mathematician, was the one to figure out that our planet should really be a frozen ball of ice. And the reason it isn't is because we have this incredible atmosphere that traps the Earth's heat, just like a blanket traps our body heat at night to keep us warm, keeping us 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer or 30 degrees Celsius warmer than we would be otherwise. By the 1850s, John Tyndall, an Irish scientist originally from Galway, he discovered that there's certain gases that are causing this effect. They called them greenhouse gases, but they're really heat-trapping gases: water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane. He also connected these gases to coal mining. In the 1850s, he realized that we were producing more of these gases through human activities. And Eunice Foote, an American amateur scientist from upstate New York in 1856, conducted an experiment in her backyard with a series of glass jars that led her to hypothesize that if carbon dioxide levels were higher at any time in the Earth's history, the planet would be warmer. Isn't that amazing? We know now, thanks to looking at the global temperature record, that the planet is indeed warming. But Guy Callendar in the 1930s, a British engineer, was the first person to ride around the world, collect all the weather station data, add it all up. And in this paper he wrote in 1937, he says, "You will not believe what I have to say, but I will show you that the planet is warming due to us using fossil fuels." He wrote that in 1938. And today we know that our future depends on our choices. Will we continue to burn fossil fuels, producing more and more carbon? Or will we wean ourselves off fossil fuels to clean sources of energy that reduce our carbon emissions? But did you know that the first person to calculate the impact of our choices was Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish chemist who won the Nobel Prize for Physical Chemistry? He is a very distant cousin, something like third cousin 5 times removed, of Greta Thunberg's. And he was the first person to calculate by hand how much the planet would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. He did it in the 1890s. So we have known for more than 100 years that our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases. We are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet that it does not need. And the future of our planet is in our hands. In subsequent decades, we've looked at every other natural factor that we've known to have caused climate change in the past. Today, if the sun were the one causing us to change, we'd be getting cooler, not warmer, because the sun's energy has been going down the last 40 or 50 years. It can't be natural cycles like El Nino because they just move heat around the climate system like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. And today the whole planet is warming. And it can't be the ice age cycles, because according to the ice age cycles, we should be getting very slowly, gradually cooler, heading eventually into another ice age. Not now, from 1500 years, but according to ice age cycles, that's what should be happening. Instead, we're getting warmer faster and faster. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, I and my colleagues took a handful of published studies. There's been 38 of them over the past 10 years, as opposed to 10,000 other studies saying climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious. There's 38 studies that said either climate isn't changing or humans aren't responsible or the impacts aren't serious. We took those 38 studies, we recalculated every single one of them from scratch. And when I say we, it was primarily our lead author, Rasmus Benestad, with the rest of us supporting him. And in every single one of those, we found an error, a false assumption, a missing factor. We found something wrong that if it were corrected, it brought that paper 100% in line with the scientific consensus. So yes, we really are sure. So what do we know now then that's new if we've known all of this for so long? Well, one of the biggest things we know today is that wherever we live, and this is only a map for the US, but you could look at this map all over the world. Wherever we live, we know that we are vulnerable to naturally occurring weather and climate disasters like floods, wildfires, droughts, heat waves, hurricanes, cyclones, typhoons, and more. And in fact, where I live in Texas, there are more billion-dollar weather and climate events than any other state in the country. So Texas is more vulnerable to these events than any other state. How does this relate to climate change? It's as if we have a natural pair of dice, and we always have a chance of naturally rolling a double six, which is a record-breaking drought or heat wave or wildfire or storm. But as the planet warms decade by decade, it's sneaking in and it's taking one of those numbers, like the 1 there on top, and turning it into a 6 too. And then it takes the 5 on the side and it turns it into a 7. And all of a sudden, we're rolling double sixes much more frequently than we should be. And we even roll an occasional double 7. We say, how could this be happening? We know that one of the biggest ways that climate change is affecting us, our lives, our health, and the economy, is through increasing the risk of extreme weather and climate events. Like what? Well, for example, like heavy rainfall. Why? Because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along today, there's a lot more water vapor sitting up there for that storm to sweep up and dump on us than there was 50 or 100 years ago. And across the United States, we have seen significant increases since the 1950s in heavy precipitation. And in fact, all across the mid-latitudes around the world, we see these major increases in heavy precipitation. It is one of the hallmark fingerprints, so to speak, of human-induced warming of the planet. Extreme precipitation is getting worse, even when it isn't just about normal storms, because a lot of storms, especially atmospheric rivers that come across the ocean, and tropical storms, which are called hurricanes or typhoons or cyclones, depending on where you live, they're powered by the ocean. And the ocean is absorbing over 90% of the extra heat that's being trapped inside the climate system by this blanket that we're wrapping around the planet. Over 90% of that heat's going into the ocean, where it can power much stronger storms. So we aren't seeing more frequent hurricanes. We aren't. They're not more frequent. But they have a lot more rainfall associated with them. And they are intensifying faster thanks to the warm ocean water. More of them are stronger storms, same total number, but more of them are stronger. They're moving more slowly, so they sit over us for longer to dump more rain. They're getting bigger. They stay stronger further northward. And of course, we've got sea level rising too, which means the storm surges are getting worse as well. We know that heat waves have become more frequent and cold waves have become less frequent, even though we still have those cold outbreaks like we just had last weekend across Canada and the northern United States. We still have cold weather, but in general, we're seeing that our extreme heat is getting more frequent. And last summer, for example, almost 400 all-time high temperature records were set across the Northern Hemisphere, many more times than cold temperature records. We're seeing, in terms of the dice being loaded against us, Europe had 500-year summers in 15 years. That's not a 500-year summer if you have 5 of them in 15 years. That's a 3-year summer. We also know that wildfires, they're not getting more frequent in North America because in the United States, most of them are human ignition. Up in Canada, they're much more natural ignition, but in highly populated areas, they're mostly human ignition. But once they get started, they're burning greater and greater area. It was December 2017 when the Thomas Fire became the largest wildfire on record in California, but that record was broken by August 2018 by the Ranch Fire, and it was smashed by November 2018 by the Camp Fire. And of course, this past November, which feels like it was 3 years ago, but it was just 6 months ago, there was another horrific wildfire season in California. Alaska this past year had the most expensive wildfire season on record. The most expensive insured disaster in Canada's history was the Fort McMurray wildfire, which they are now experiencing right now, massive floods right in the middle of this pandemic. And of course, if you think back to January, what were the headlines in January all about? They were about Australia, about the devastating bushfires in Australia that were affecting people, that were affecting their health, and that were affecting the lives of more than 1 billion animals. So what's new? What's new is the fact that we know that climate change is affecting the risks, the frequency or the intensity of these events. And the question is not, did climate change cause the event? As if either it's natural or it's human, but it's nothing in between. No, every event today is occurring over an altered background. Climate change has altered the background over which every event occurs today. So the question is not, did climate change cause something? The question is, did climate change make it worse? That's the question. And 10 years ago, we were able to say, we can't speak to any specific event, but in general, we can say that hurricanes are getting bigger or stronger or wildfires burning more area. But you know what? Today, we can speak to individual events, and that is new. Like what? We know that, for example, with Hurricane Harvey that hit Houston back in 2017, we know that it's estimated anywhere between 15% to as much as 40% of the rain that fell during that storm would not have happened if the same storm had occurred 100 years ago, which it easily could have. A massive hurricane hit Galveston, just south of Houston, in 1900. But it would have had a lot less rain associated with it in a world that wasn't as warm. We know, for example, that the devastating heat wave that Europe experienced last summer was 5 times more likely as the result of a changing climate. And in terms of the area being burned by wildfire across the western United States, we know that the area burned by wildfire since the 1980s has more than doubled as a result of a changing climate. The light yellow is what would have been burned anyways because wildfire is natural and it happens anyways in those ecosystems. The orange is the additional area burned because of the effects of a changing climate, making it hotter and drier. In the words of the Prime Minister of Dominica, which is one of the islands that was devastated by the 2017 hurricane season, he said, "To deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived." The best description that I have of climate change is that used by the US military. Climate change is a threat multiplier. We don't care about a 1 or 2 or 3 degree change in the average temperature of the planet per se. We care about it because it affects what matters to us. It affects our health, our families, the economy, the places where we live, the things we enjoy doing. Climate change affects every single one of us. The reason why we care might be different for all of us, but we all care because it is a threat multiplier that takes everything we care about and makes it worse. So get ready for another question again, just to make sure you're paying attention. Here we go. In one word, or if you have to use 2 words, use a dot, right? You know how this works now. In one word, what is climate change affecting that you care about? I was on Instagram the other week with Burton Snowboards. So they would say winter snow, obviously. We care about climate change because it affects our health, our children's future, our kids and our students, our water supply, yep, skiing. It disproportionately affects the poor. It's affecting pretty much everything. And look at these answers here. These answers here are all, just making it full screen, these answers here are all different, right? But that's okay, they should be different because we're all different people. And the reason we care about climate change is different depending on who we are. We don't have to all care about it for the same reasons, but whoever we are is already the perfect person to care. That's the bottom line here. All right, so taking it back to my slides here, hopefully you'll still be able to see the slides, just a second. Now we're on number 3 out of 4. What are we just starting to realize that we didn't already? And what we're starting to realize is just how far out of the ballpark we are. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at our CO2 levels in the past, and this is just showing the ice core record over the last 800,000 years in the orange, we know that our CO2 levels have now passed, well past 410. They're almost at 420 parts per million. And we haven't seen levels that high for at least 15 million years when we did not have 8 billion humans on the planet. That's the whole point. If our emissions continue to grow over the century, we will see levels that the planet hasn't experienced in tens of millions of years. And here's the kicker. As far back as we can go in time, even to periods that have been warmer than today, we cannot find any time when this much carbon has been going into the atmosphere this fast. The closest analog, about 50 million years ago, at that time, about 1/10 of the carbon was going into the atmosphere on average per year. It's estimated, as well as we can estimate from back then. So as I wrote with my colleague Bob Kopp a couple of years ago in this short essay, which is open access if you want to look it up, we said, Aristotle might argue that humans were not responsible for the choices made at the beginning of the industrial era when collective scientific and societal knowledge limited our capacity to choose wisely and well. But over the last few centuries, regardless of our original ignorance, we have been conducting an unprecedented experiment with the Earth's climate system. What we are just starting to understand is how far and how fast we are pushing our planet in a way that has never been done before. Now, just to be clear, there is no magic amount of carbon emissions that if we just produce this much, we'll be 100% okay. But if we just go right over that limit, all of a sudden we're going to hell in a handbasket and the world's going to end. No, it's just like there's no magic number of cigarettes you can smoke and be 100% okay, but if you smoke that 10,000th cigarette, all of a sudden it's all over. No, we know the more carbon we produce, the worse it's going to be. And so the faster we cut our emissions, the better off we'll be, and the greater the chance we have of avoiding some really nasty surprises. That's what we're just starting to understand. And we're also starting to understand that there's tremendous benefits to doing so. Did you know that by objective analysis, just looking at the cost of climate change over a few sectors, not all of them, just a few sectors, and comparing the economic impacts of climate change on a few sectors with the cost of reducing our emissions, for the United States, we would break even over between 5 to 20 years. And that's only a few sectors. If you included more sectors, you probably just get 5 or 6 years we break even. So we know that there are benefits to acting now. So when we see people saying things like, it's just a natural cycle and you scientists are just making the whole thing up to line your pockets. I get this all the time on social media. And if you follow me on social media, you see it every day. We often think to ourselves, if they just knew the facts, surely they'd change their minds, right? And in fact, this is the title of one of our global weirding episodes on YouTube. So if you're interested, look it up and give it a quick watch. Not right now, after we're done. So that brings me to something else that we're just starting to learn now, and it has nothing to do with physical science. It has everything to do with social science, with how we as humans interact with information. The idea that if we just give people information, they'll say, oh, of course, and they'll write it on the blank slate of their mind, is something called the knowledge deficit model. And this model was tested by a social science researcher called Dan Kahan and his colleagues back in 2012. And he said, we conducted a study to test this and we found no support. People with the highest degree of science literacy were not most concerned about climate change. They were the most polarized. And he and his colleagues went on to say, public division over climate change doesn't come from people not understanding the science. It comes from our personal interest in forming beliefs that are in line with others with whom we have close ties. Then Dan and his colleagues went on to develop something they called ordinary science intelligence. Now, it's just one measure of IQ. This one's specifically related to how we understand scientific information like data and things like that. And they found a very weak correlation. The line goes up, but just up a little bit, a very weak correlation between ordinary science intelligence and whether people would agree that there's solid evidence that global warming is happening due to burning fossil fuels, which of course we've known now since the 1850s, right? But then they took this data and they split it in half based on one thing. Ready? They split it in half based on political affiliation. And what this shows is very insightful. It shows, and I will translate this into English, that being smarter does not make any of us more accepting of science. It just makes us better able to cherry pick the information we need to validate what we already believe if we feel strongly enough about it. And when it comes to climate change, if we're of a certain political persuasion, we're the ones who do that. But you know what? We do this in other areas of our lives too. We all do this. The smarter we are, if we hold on to something, if we have a really tightly held belief, the smarter we are, the better we are at finding justification for why we're right, right? That's why the whole legal profession exists. So that's why more information is not necessarily what's going to change people's minds. And this brings us to the last section, which is, what has the pandemic taught us? The last 2 months have been unprecedented in any of our lifetimes. The last time we went through a situation like this was back in the days of my great-grandparents, who both lost their lives to the Spanish flu pandemic. What have we as a collective society around the world seen, and how does that apply to climate change? Well, one of the biggest things that we've seen is this. The myths that we believe about climate change are often the same ones that we believe or believed until it hit us in the face about the pandemic. And interestingly, and I just saw this myself on social media today, but we've been seeing this for weeks. Interestingly, many of the same actors, the same people, and the same organizations who actively spread false information about climate change are spreading false information about the pandemic, about the virus, about solutions, about its origin, and about what we should be doing about our current situation. It's the same people. So it isn't just about climate change. What we're seeing is there is an underlying issue in our society. There's an underlying issue in our psychology too. And our reaction to climate change is a symptom of our psychology and our society. And our reaction to the coronavirus pandemic is also a symptom of our psychology and our society. Let me dig into this a little bit further so you can see what I mean. Number one, when it comes to climate change, one of the first most dangerous myths we've bought into is not the myth that the science isn't real, it's the myth that only certain types of people worry about it. We know that over the past 25 years in the United States, as well as in my home of Canada, as well as we see this political polarization happening in Australia and the UK, we see it across the EU as well, places like Brazil. But for the purposes of this, it's easy to look at just two political parties. We know that the US has gotten a lot more politically polarized. Back in 1994, this was the political landscape. And as we step forward in time, it goes like this. And then if you only look at people who voted in the last election, it looks like this. Yes. So what falls right into the gap between those two? All of those value and fact-based issues, like climate change and like the pandemic response. What does this have to do with climate change? Pretty much everything, because it turns out that the number one predictor of whether we agree with 150 years of science, okay, technically 170 years of science, telling us that climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, the number one factor is not how smart we are, it's not how educated we are, it is simply where we fall on the political spectrum. Today in the United States, according to this 2020 poll by the Pew Foundation, climate change is the most politically polarized issue in the entire United States. The width of the gray bar shows you which issues are more polarized. The bigger the bar, the further apart people are on this issue, depending on where they fall politically. Number one is climate change. Number two is environmental protection. Isn't that sad? But here's the even sadder thing. Back in the beginning of March, remember the beginning of March? It sort of feels like a year ago, just 2 months ago, the beginning of March. There were twice as many Democrats who said that they thought the coronavirus pandemic posed a threat to the number of Republicans in early March. And then by mid-March, it turned out that 68% of Democrats were worried, whereas only 40% of Republicans were. And they were more likely to do things like avoid large crowds and wash their hands frequently. And then a detailed political poll released by the Pew Research Center found a number of differences in terms of whether people think the risks are exaggerated and how dangerous they think the pandemic is. That depended on people's political affiliation. You can see those polls on the right-hand side. So I really like this thoughtful essay by Justin Murphy, writing about, well, why are conservatives less worried? Because we know that in general, conservatives are usually more sensitive to pathogen threats. So why is it flipped? He said, and you won't be surprised now, he said, the answer is hiding in the phenomenon of political polarization. Partisan polarization can effectively reverse otherwise robust correlations between, where we fall on the political spectrum and what type of things we worry about, because it effectively changes empirical reality itself in the eyes of individuals perceiving it. And you might say, well, sure, that happens to people with the pandemic, but how could it happen with climate change? A thermometer gives you the same answer regardless of how you vote. It does, but you know what? I don't have these results to show you, but a social scientist called Larry Hamilton in New Hampshire, after they had a record warm winter in January 7, 2017 in New Hampshire, he polled people in the state in February. So just the next month. He said, was January in New Hampshire warmer than average or not? And it was 8 degrees warmer than average, so yes. And he didn't ask them about global warming. He didn't ask them about climate change. He just said, the thermometers in your car and in your backyard, did it tell you January was warmer than average? And guess what? The biggest difference between responses was who they'd voted for in the previous election. Yes. So absolutely, partisan polarization can actually alter empirical reality itself. in the eyes of the people observing it. Clearly, it doesn't actually alter it. You can't say gravity isn't real, so I'll step off the cliff. But it is really dangerous to ignore reality, because the bottom line is we can't just float around in outer space without the resources that this planet supplies. This planet provides everything for us. The air that you're breathing right now, the water we drink, the food we eat, the materials we use to make everything we have come from this planet. And here's what we've seen with the pandemic. It turns out that no matter where we fall in the political spectrum, when disaster stares us right in the eyeballs, when it is no longer a distant issue, when it's looking right at us, we care about the same things. We care about the health and the safety of our families, our friends, our loved ones, our communities. That is what coronavirus threatens, and that is exactly what climate change threatens too. The truth is, to care about either the pandemic or our changing climate, we only have to be one thing. That's a human living on this earth. And as far as I know, we are all that. So that's myth number one, that only certain type of people care. What's myth number two? Myth number two is that these are distant issues. They only matter to people far away. With climate change, it turns out that most people across the whole US agree that it's happening. These are fantastic maps from the Yale Program on Climate Communication. You can see responses to over 30 questions related to climate impacts, attitudes, and solutions by county or by congressional district. They have these maps for Canada as well, not as many questions, but they do have a lot of them for Canada too, by riding. And anywhere that's orange means that more than 50% of people would say yes to the question. Blue would be less than 50%, and the darker the color, the more people would say yes. So it turns out everybody says it's happening. And not everybody, but the majority say it's happening. It will harm plants and animals. It will harm future generations. It will probably harm people in countries who live far away. It might harm people in the US. You're seeing there's a lot more blue here. But ready? This is the kicker. Do you think it will harm you? No. We are psychologically distant from the issue of climate change. And you know what? We were distant in the same way on the coronavirus pandemic. Look at this figure here. Back in February, less than 40% of people, anywhere between about 35 to 38% of people, actually were concerned about the coronavirus. Why? We thought it was over there. We didn't think it was here. It was over there. We thought it was distant from us, psychologically and physically. But then our level of concern started to increase. And here's the fascinating thing. Round about the second week in March, right after the first week in March, that's when we got to about 60% of people being concerned. And that dropped down a little bit and then went back up. You know where we are on climate change? On climate change, we are where we were at in the second week of March. This past January, the Yale Program on Climate Communication found the biggest jumps they had ever recorded in levels of concern about climate change, and now 58% of us are either alarmed or concerned about climate change. So we are back there. And what happened in the second week in March? I don't know if you remember, but I will remember vividly the rest of my life. I was in Ireland. I was giving a series of very carefully planned and organized talks because I only fly in person when I have multiple events to do in the same place. I had 18 talks, lectures, and panels to give in 11 days. I'd been organizing this for over a year. I was halfway through in the second week of March. And almost overnight, events went from, well, we'll do live stream only with no audience, to, oh, we can't even do live stream. Oh, everything's shut down. Oh, you better get back quickly. In the second week in March, that was when everything changed. We reacted quickly, not quite quickly enough, but we reacted quickly enough in many places to make a difference. Are we doing the same on climate change? Not yet. The truth is, both coronavirus and climate change are already affecting us here and now. Then there's one more myth. Ready? Oh, sorry. Before I go on, let me just highlight some research from Chris Chu, one of my colleagues here at Texas Tech. He found something really interesting. He found, and we saw this with coronavirus, that when the impacts come close, the ideological polarization is reduced. So when it's impacts over there in the future or the other side of the world, we're very partisan about it. But when we actually bring it home to where we live and we talk about what's happening where we live, the partisanship decreases. That's really important. Hold that in your mind for a couple more minutes. But the third most dangerous myth we bought into is that the only viable solutions are bad. Does this sound familiar? They harm the economy, they infringe on my personal rights, and I can't agree with any of them. These are headlines from just today. Yes, we need to reopen because it is harming, and it is harming small businesses, it is harming people's income, but we don't see any positive to the solutions. When it comes to a changing climate, people often say, are you just talking about returning to the Stone Ages? Or, and you can't make this stuff up, this is a real headline and subhead, I don't want to destroy the economy over climate change, as the subhead says, 1 million Florida homes at risk due to climate change. We don't think there's any positive solutions, but with climate change, it turns out there are. The truth is fossil fuel use is harmful and expensive, and the pandemic is the most dangerous we've experienced in 100 years. But when the Yale program on climate communication asks people about real climate solutions, not do you want to destroy the economy to fix climate change? They don't ask that. They say, do you support research into renewable energy? Everybody says yes. Do you support subsidies for people who purchase energy efficient vehicles or solar panels? Yes. I don't know what's up with Texas, but we're getting them here too. Do you support putting a price on carbon? 66% of people say yes, and there's many conservatives who support this. It turns out that 32% of us have already actually taken steps to reward companies that we think are doing the right thing. Only 4% of Americans say that they eat less meat, but the vast majority, 94%, say they're willing to. We are willing to take tangible action. The problem is our threat meter is unbalanced. We think the solutions are negative and punitive, whereas the impacts are distant and far off. And in fact, it's exactly the opposite. The impacts are here today, but the solutions could change our lives. They could actually make us less vulnerable to pandemics. Did you know that if you live in an area that is highly polluted, you are much more likely to suffer severely if you contract the coronavirus or even die from it than if you live in an area where you don't have bad air pollution from burning fossil fuels? It's related. And then, though, there's one more map that's bluer. Remember I showed you the dark blue map? I don't think it affects me personally. The last map shows us what to do about it. The darkest blue map is this. Do you ever hear anyone talk about it? And that is why, in my opinion, the single most important thing that every single one of us can do about this is talk about it. But not talking by arguing with each other. If you begin the conversation with something you disagree on, it's not going to go anywhere positive. You have to begin by bonding over something that you genuinely share with somebody, connecting the dots to decrease that psychological distance and partisanship, and inspire with positive solutions so people don't think the only answer is to destroy the economy. Not arguing, like Susie and Calvin here, but rather bonding over shared values, connecting the dots to how climate change affects what we care about, and then talking about ways that we can work together to fix this thing. What types of things can we bond over? The place where we live, our family, a shared faith, an activity we both enjoy, military experience, being a member of the same club. I've bonded over knitting and food and being a mom and living in Texas. And then talking about solutions that are positive. The fact that over 20% of our electricity on the Texas grid comes from clean sources. We have the first carbon neutral airport in North America, in Texas, the second one, San Diego. We have the biggest army base in the US. You're not surprised about that, but did you know it's been powered by wind and solar energy for 2 years? What about what's happening with companies reducing their carbon footprint? What about what's happening with faith communities taking steps to reduce their carbon footprint? What about what's happening with coal mines putting solar panels on the roof? Or airlines figuring out how to run their jets off carbon neutral biofuel? They're already doing it. They've been doing it for 3 years at the LA airport. I love telling stories of what's happening in unexpected places and ways around the world, whether it's kids figuring out how to grow algae biofuel in their bedrooms, or some of the poorest countries in the world who live in energy poverty having their lives changed by clean energy. I love sharing the fact that, did you know that over 70% of new energy being installed around the world today is clean energy? It overtook fossil fuels in 2014. Project Drawdown is a fantastic source of great climate solutions and stories. If you're looking for any conversation starters, go to Project Drawdown. They have over 100 amazing conversation starters. The pandemic did cut our carbon emissions, but it's not going to cut them long term because they were not achieved through sustainable changes. Shutting down the economy, throwing people out of work, taking kids out of school, those are not long-term sustainable changes. But we know that if these reductions had been achieved through increasing efficiency, through clean energy, through behavior modification that was sustainable, it would have been amazing. How big? Well, as you know, there's no magic threshold, but if we want to meet a 1.5 degree target, one way to do that is reduce our emissions about 40 to 50% by 2030, and then all the way to zero by about 2060. That's according to the IPCC. It's not a magic threshold, it's just if we wanted to meet 1.5 degrees, for example, that's what we would do. If we had achieved our reductions sustainably, as opposed to unsustainably the last few weeks, if we had achieved them through efficiency reduction, through clean energy that kept industry on, that kept the doors open, that kept people employed, we would be halfway to our climate target in a few weeks. If that is not incredible, what is? So what this pandemic has really taught us is that when it all comes down to it, we can do it. Not like this, not shutting down the economy and throwing people out of work. But what happens around the world affects us all. And climate action is action for the health, not just of our planet, the blue skies and the wildlife that we see the pictures of. It is action for every single one of us too, no matter where we live, no matter how we vote. So that's why the single most effective thing I believe we can do is talk about true, sustainable, positive, beneficial climate solutions that matter to every single one of us, and the impacts that we will avoid in the places where we live, the things that we love by doing so. Does talking about it make a difference? It turns out it does. Discussing it with friends and family helps us know more. The more we know, the more concerned we are. The more concerned we are, the more we talk about it. It's a true positive feedback loop. This is according to the research. And then you might say, well, I'm not a scientist. According to the social science research, you're the best person to talk about it. That's right, friends and family are the most trusted messengers, people who share our values. And so that's why I didn't give you my TED Talk today, but that's why when I was asked to give a TED Talk, I said the most important thing we can do is talk about climate change. And if you want examples, if you want templates, if you want more info, please give it a watch or a read.